I pushed away the best man I ever had because I couldn't believe he still wanted me after I gained weight. My name is Ronnie, and this is the story of how I destroyed my perfect relationship with my own insecurities. When I got fat, Bennett never said a word about my changing body. He kept looking at me with those same loving eyes, kept trying to plan dates, kept bringing me flowers. But in my twisted mind, I decided his silence meant disgust. I convinced myself he was no longer attracted to me, that he was looking at other women, that he was only staying out of obligation. I pulled away, found validation elsewhere, and then told him to his face that I wasn't attracted to him anymore. I left the man who remained faithful while I got fat. And now, watching him happily engaged to someone else, I'm drowning in regret. You want to know how I single-handedly destroyed the best relationship of my life? I'm Ronnie, 28, and I'm about to tell you how I let my own insecurities trick me into leaving a man who truly loved me, only to realize way too late what I'd thrown away. I almost skipped the backyard barbecue where I met Bennett. I had a killer headache and just wanted to binge watch reality TV in my pajamas, but my friend Jenna practically dragged me there. Thank God she did, because that's where I locked eyes with Bennett across a crowded patio. He wasn't what I'd call conventionally hot. More of that quiet, thoughtful type with intelligent eyes and a smile that made you feel like you were in on some private joke. When Jenna introduced us, he completely surprised me. Instead of the obvious once-over most guys give, he immediately asked about the true crime podcast Jenna had mentioned I was obsessed with. We ended up talking for hours while everyone else played drinking games. By the end of the night, I knew he worked in tech, could make ridiculous chocolate chip cookies, and had the most adorable habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking hard about something. Our relationship developed so naturally it almost felt too easy. Coffee shop run-ins turned into intentional dates. Casual texts evolved into hours-long phone calls. On our third official date, we got caught in a surprise downpour during a hike and ended up sheltering in his car, soaking wet and laughing hysterically. When he kissed me that day, raindrops still clinging to his eyelashes, I swear I felt something click into place. This was different. I won't lie, our chemistry was off the charts. We couldn't keep our hands off each other those first months. Sometimes we'd be cooking dinner and wouldn't even make it to the bedroom. The way he looked at me made me feel beautiful in ways no compliment ever could. I remember specific moments. Him tracing the curve of my waist, whispering how perfect I felt in his arms, the intensity in his eyes when he pulled me toward him. My friends were immediately obsessed with him, especially my best friend Lacey. "Girl, he looks at you like you hung the moon," she'd say after group hangouts. Even my perpetually skeptical mother admitted he seemed decent enough, which, coming from a woman who'd spent the last decade convinced every man I dated was secretly a con artist, was practically a ringing endorsement. We moved in together after 8 months. Found this cute 2-bedroom with a tiny balcony where Bennett attempted and spectacularly failed at growing herbs. Those early days of cohabitation were blissful. Morning coffee routines, evening cuddles on the couch with my feet in his lap, and yes, plenty of passionate physical connection. I remember thinking how lucky I was, how I'd somehow skipped all the relationship drama my friends constantly complained about. Bennett and I rarely fought. When issues came up, he'd approach them with this calm, problem-solving attitude that initially I found incredibly reassuring. He'd listen to my perspective, suggest compromises, and we'd move on. No yelling, no passive-aggressive silent treatments, no weaponizing intimacy. Our friends would joke that we were relationship goals, and I'd smugly agree, feeling like I'd somehow won the boyfriend lottery. But somewhere along the way, I started sabotaging us. It began with checking his phone when he was in the shower. Not because he'd ever given me reason not to trust him, but because my ex had cheated, and Lacey's horror stories about men had gotten under my skin. I never found anything suspicious, but instead of feeling relieved, I'd invent scenarios. Maybe he had a second phone. Maybe he deleted the suspicious texts. Looking back now, that was the beginning of the end. But not because of anything Bennett did. The seeds of doubt I was planting would eventually grow into a forest I couldn't see through. The weight crept on so gradually I barely noticed at first. It started when I got promoted at work. Suddenly, I was managing a team, drowning in meetings, and stress eating my way through lunch at my desk. Fast food became my go-to because who had time to meal prep? Bennett would offer to cook healthy dinners, but I'd usually already demolished a burger and fries before getting home. I'd lie and say I wasn't hungry, then snack after he went to bed. My doctor put me on anxiety medication with weight gain as a side effect, but honestly, I was already well down that path. Within 8 months, I'd gone up 3 dress sizes. My face looked puffy in photos, my chin had doubled, and my once defined waistline had disappeared. Shopping became a nightmare. I'd leave stores empty-handed and in tears, unable to find anything that didn't make me look like I was wearing a tent. Bennett never said a word about my changing body. Not one single comment. And somehow, that was worse than if he just said something. His silence felt loaded with unspoken judgment. When we'd visit his parents for Sunday dinner, his mother would give me these once-overs and say things like, "Oh, I made brownies, but maybe we should skip dessert tonight," with this fake concerned smile. Bennett would just sit there, never defending me, never telling her to back off. Each silent car ride home, my resentment grew. Our physical relationship changed dramatically. The passionate, spontaneous encounters dwindled until they practically disappeared. Bennett stopped initiating entirely. When I try, he'd say he was tired or stressed about work. Eventually, I stopped trying too. The rejection was too painful. On the rare occasions we did have sex, I'd catch him closing his eyes and I'd wonder if he was imagining someone else. Someone who looked like I used to. I tried talking to him about it once, asking if he was still attracted to me. "Of course I am," he said, sounding almost surprised by the question. "I love you." But the words rang hollow when matched against his actions or lack thereof. I wanted him to desire me, not just love me out of habit or obligation. I wanted to feel the way I did when we first met, when his eyes would follow me around a room like he couldn't believe his luck. That feeling was long gone, replaced by something that felt disturbingly like pity. I started working late more often, partly to avoid the awkward silence of our apartment, but also because there was this guy in marketing, Derek, who actually seemed to see me. He'd compliment my presentations, laugh at my jokes, bring me coffee just the way I liked it. Nothing inappropriate ever happened, I made sure of that. But those little moments of validation became addictive. I'd find myself dressing up more for work than for date nights with Bennett. When Derek would text me work questions after hours, I jumped to respond, while letting Bennett's messages sit unanswered. "You seem distant lately," Bennett said one night as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, both scrolling our phones instead of watching the show playing on TV. I denied it immediately, turning it back on him, accusing him of being the distant one. We had our first real fight that night. Well, as much of a fight as you could have with someone as relentlessly reasonable as Bennett. He suggested couples therapy. I laughed in his face and told him we didn't need a stranger telling us how to fix our relationship. The truth was, I was terrified a therapist would see right through me. Lacey and my friends became my echo chamber during this time. Over wine nights, they'd rally around me with toxic validation. "Girl, you're a queen, and you should worship the ground you walk on regardless of your size," they'd insist. "If he's not making you feel beautiful, that's emotional neglect." They'd show me Instagram posts about letting go of relationships that don't serve you and knowing your worth. None of them had maintained a relationship longer than a year, but somehow they were relationship experts when it came to mine. Meanwhile, Bennett kept trying in his own way. He'd suggest weekend hikes that I'd refuse, claiming I was too tired. He'd plan date nights that I'd find excuses to cancel. When he bought me flowers one day just because, I immediately assumed it was out of guilt. What was he hiding? Who was he texting? The fact that I found nothing when I checked his phone again only convinced me he must be getting better at covering his tracks. The breaking point came when I was using Bennett's laptop and accidentally opened his browser history. There it was, page after page of porn featuring thin, petite women who looked nothing like current me, women who looked like I used to. I felt physically sick, tears burning in my eyes as I scrolled through what felt like irrefutable evidence that he wasn't attracted to me anymore. Instead of talking to him about it, I quietly closed the laptop and added it to my mental file of grievances. 2 weeks later, I decided to try a new approach. If physical intimacy was our problem, I'd use it as leverage. I bought new lingerie that I felt reasonably confident in, lit candles around our bedroom, and waited for Bennett to come home. When he walked in, clearly surprised, I expected immediate interest. Instead, he looked almost uncomfortable, making an excuse about needing to finish a work email first. By the time he finally came to bed, I'd changed into sweatpants and pretended to be asleep. That night solidified something terrible in my mind. He truly wasn't attracted to me anymore. What hurt most wasn't just the rejection, but how he didn't even seem to care that I was rejecting him back. My attempts to weaponize intimacy completely backfired because the weapon had no power. He didn't want me enough for it to matter. Lie awake at night scrolling through old photos of us, comparing my former body to my current one, calculating how many pounds stood between me and Bennett's desire. At work, my emotional connection with Derek intensified, though still never crossing physical boundaries. I'd find reasons to stop by his desk, forwarding him memes throughout the day, laughing too loudly at his jokes during meetings. One day he mentioned his recent breakup, and I heard myself saying things like, "She clearly didn't appreciate what she had, and some women don't recognize a good man when they see one." The irony was completely lost on me. Bennett noticed, of course. "You mentioned Derek a lot," he said casually one evening. The accusation in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Instead of diffusing the situation, I exploded, turning it back on him. "Oh, so you're allowed to look at other women online, but I can't have male friends? Is that how this works?" He looked genuinely confused, and I realized he had no idea I'd seen his search history. Rather than explaining, I stormed out of the room, slamming our bedroom door like a teenager. The next morning, I found Bennett sleeping on the couch. He'd made coffee and left a note saying he thought we should talk when we were both calmer. The reasonable gesture made me even angrier. Why couldn't he just fight dirty like a normal person? His perpetual high road made me feel even more like the villain in our story. I crumpled the note, left the coffee untouched, and went to work early. That afternoon, I called my mother in tears from my office parking lot. Unlike my friends, Mom had always been skeptical of Bennett, not because of anything he'd done, but because she was skeptical of all men on principle after my father left when I was 12. "He's making me feel invisible, Mom," I sobbed into the phone. "I don't even think he sees me anymore." She didn't hesitate. "Then he doesn't deserve you, sweetheart. No man is worth feeling like that." Her words were exactly what I wanted to hear, validation that I was the wronged party here. When I got home that evening, Bennett had prepared my favorite dinner. "I think we need to talk about what's happening with us," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "I feel like you're pulling away and I don't know why." Something in me snapped. All the insecurity, all the resentment, all the projected shame came pouring out in the cruelest words I've ever said. "Maybe I'm pulling away because I'm not attracted to you anymore," I spat, watching his face fall. "Maybe I'm tired of pretending that this boring routine we've fallen into is enough for me." The hurt in his eyes should have stopped me, but I was on a roll, unable or unwilling to stem the flow of venom. "I see the way you look at other women. I know what kind of content you watch online. Don't pretend you're still into me when we both know that's a lie." Bennett sat perfectly still, absorbing each word like a physical blow. When I finally ran out of steam, the silence between us stretched into something unbearable. "Is that really how you feel?" he finally asked, his voice unnaturally calm. I nodded, already regretting my words but too proud to take them back. "I think," he said slowly, "that you're projecting your own insecurities onto me. I've never stopped being attracted to you, Ronnie, but I can't compete with whatever narrative you've created in your head." He suggested again that we try couples therapy. I laughed bitterly. "So I can pay someone to tell me why you don't want to touch me anymore? No thanks." The conversation circled painfully for another hour, neither of us really hearing the other. Bennett eventually went to bed alone, and I stayed up texting Lacey and my other friends, who predictably sympathized entirely with my side of the story. You deserve someone who makes you feel beautiful every single day, Lacey texted. If he's not doing that, maybe it's time to move on. The other girls in our group chat echoed the sentiment, sending supportive gifts and telling me I was a whole queen who deserved better. Their validation felt like oxygen, and I screenshotted their messages to read again whenever doubt crept in. The following weekend, I drove to my mother's house, ostensibly to help her with some yard work, but really to continue building my case against Bennett. Mom listened attentively as I detailed all the ways he'd failed me, carefully omitting my own role in our deterioration. "Honey," she said, refilling my wine glass, "if he's making you feel this bad about yourself, what are you even getting from this relationship anymore?" What indeed? By the time I drove home Sunday evening, I'd convinced myself that leaving Bennett was not just justified but necessary for my self-respect. I'd crafted an entire narrative where he was the villain of our story. The shallow man who couldn't love a woman through physical changes, the emotionally unavailable partner who made me seek connection elsewhere. It was so much easier than facing the truth that I'd sabotaged our relationship because I couldn't bear the reflection of my own insecurities. I didn't plan for the breakup to happen that night, but when I walked into our apartment and found Bennett waiting up for me, something in me decided it was now or never. "I think we should end this," I said before he could even ask how my weekend had been. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I expected. Part of me hoped he'd fight for us, beg me to reconsider, promise to change, though what exactly he needed to change, I couldn't have articulated clearly if asked. Instead, he just looked tired. "Is this really what you want, Ronnie?" The resignation in his voice ignited my anger again. Why wasn't he fighting harder? "Yes," I said firmly. "I think we've been over for a while now. We're just going through the motions." I launched into my rehearsed speech about needing to find myself and how we'd grown apart. His eyes never left mine, but I could see him withdrawing emotionally with each word. "If that's how you feel, I won't try to convince you otherwise," he finally said. "But I think you're making a mistake based on assumptions that aren't true." The calm way he said it, like he was discussing a minor disagreement about dinner plans rather than the end of our 3-year relationship, made me even more certain I was doing the right thing. Someone who truly loved me would be falling apart right now, wouldn't they? The logistics happened with surreal efficiency. I found an overpriced one-bedroom I could barely afford. Bennett helped me move, which somehow made me resent him more. Why couldn't he just be awful and validate my decision? My mother came down for the weekend to help me settle in, reinforcing at every opportunity that I'd made the right choice. "Now you can focus on yourself, sweetheart. Find the Ronnie that got lost in that relationship." The first few weeks of single life felt like freedom. I re-downloaded dating apps, posted cryptic quotes about outgrowing situations that no longer serve you on social media, and fully embraced the glow up after breakup mentality. I bought new clothes that flattered my current body, experimented with different makeup techniques Lacey showed me, and started posting more selfies than I had in months. Each like and supportive comment felt like validation that I'd made the right decision. Derek from work asked me out for drinks about 2 weeks after news of my breakup circulated around the office. I said yes immediately, excited by the prospect of someone who'd pursued me despite my weight gain. The date was fine. Pleasant conversation, mild flirtation. But when he kissed me goodnight, I felt nothing. No spark, no butterflies, none of the chemistry I'd convinced myself would be there. I made excuses when he texted about a second date. Similar scenarios played out over the next few months. I'd match with guys online, meet for coffee or drinks, and find myself comparing each of them to Bennett. This one talked too much about himself, that one had an annoying laugh, another wasn't ambitious enough. I'd return to my empty apartment after these dates, scrolling through social media to avoid the growing hollow feeling in my chest. Bennett and I had agreed to minimal contact to give each other space to move on, but I still found myself checking his Instagram regularly. At first, there wasn't much to see. Occasional photos of hikes or meals with friends, nothing that suggested he was devastated by our breakup, which irritated me more than I cared to admit. Where was his emotional breakdown? Where were his sad song lyrics and cryptic posts about heartbreak? 4 months after our breakup, he posted a photo from the airport. Sometimes you need to get lost to find yourself. Solo traveler, new adventures. The caption hit me like a physical blow. That trip to Portugal had been something we talked about doing together someday. Now he was going alone, without a second thought for our shared dream. The comment section was filled with encouraging messages from friends, including several female names I didn't recognize. I threw my phone across the room, then immediately retrieved it to continue torturing myself by zooming in on his smile, analyzing whether it looked genuine or forced. Reality began setting in slowly, then all at once. One night, after another mediocre date with a guy who spent the entire evening talking about his CrossFit routine, I found myself sobbing in my car in the restaurant parking lot. The truth I'd been avoiding crashed over me in waves. I'd walked away from someone who genuinely loved me because I couldn't love myself. I'd projected all my insecurities onto Bennett, creating problems that weren't there and ignoring the ones that were, mainly my own toxic mindset. I called Lacey, desperate for the validation that had become my emotional crutch. "Do you think I made a mistake leaving Bennett?" I asked through tears. Her response shocked me. "Honestly, yeah, maybe you did. He was kind of perfect for you, but you seemed so sure at the time." The betrayal stung sharply. Where was the unwavering support, the "you're better off without him" pep talk? "But you were the one who said I deserved someone who made me feel beautiful," I reminded her. "I mean, yeah," she backpedaled. "But I was just supporting whatever you wanted to do. You were the one who said he wasn't making you feel good enough." The conversation left me feeling even more alone. Had my friends just been telling me what I wanted to hear all along? Had my mother's support been more about her own baggage than my situation? For the first time, I had to face the possibility that I'd been the architect of my own unhappiness. Bennett's social media became my obsession over the next several months. I watched from afar as he seemed to transform into an even better version of himself after our breakup. More travel photos appeared, hiking in national parks, exploring cities I'd never even mentioned wanting to visit. He looked different too. Though he never posted anything explicitly about fitness, I could see the changes in his face and body. He was getting in shape, looking better than he had when we were together. Meanwhile, my life was stagnating. The initial post-breakup energy had faded, leaving me in a routine of work, takeout food, and mindless scrolling. My weight continued to climb as I comforted myself with food and alcohol. The cute new clothes I'd bought no longer fit properly. Dating had become such a depressing experience that I'd all but given up, canceling plans more often than keeping them. My apartment, once a symbol of my independence, now felt like a sad, empty box where I retreated from the world. Even my friends had started pulling away. Lacey, once my most reliable source of validation, began taking longer to respond to texts and becoming conveniently busy when I suggested wine nights. "Sorry, just swamped with work," she'd text, though her Instagram stories showed her out with other friends. When we did get together, the conversation felt strained, like she was tired of hearing the same complaints about my life without seeing any attempts to change it. My mother still provided unconditional support, but even she had started to shift her perspective. "Have you thought about reaching out to Bennett?" she asked during one of our weekly calls, shocking me into silence. "Mom, you were the one who told me I was better off without him," I reminded her. "Well, sometimes mothers tell their daughters what they need to hear in the moment," she replied vaguely. "But you don't seem happier without him." The suggestion felt like a betrayal, another person in my life refusing to maintain the narrative I'd constructed. 6 months after our breakup, I hit rock bottom. Scrolling through social media late one night, I came across a photo that stopped my heart. Bennett smiling broadly with his arm around a pretty blonde woman I'd never seen before. They were at some rooftop bar, golden hour lighting making them both look like they were glowing. The caption was simple: good times with good people. Nothing explicitly romantic, but the body language between them spoke volumes. I spent hours that night stalking this woman's profile, comparing myself to her in every possible way. She was fit but not skinny, with the kind of athletic build that suggested she actually enjoyed exercise rather than enduring it. Her page was filled with hiking photos, cooking experiments, and genuine smiles, not the carefully posed, filtered selfies that dominated my feed. She seemed authentic in a way that made my carefully curated online persona feel hollow and pathetic. The next morning, I called in sick to work and did something I never thought I'd do. I texted Bennett. "Hey, been thinking about you. How have you been?" The three dots appeared immediately, making my heart race, then disappeared for several minutes before his response finally came through. "I'm doing well, thanks. Hope you're good too." The politeness of it, the complete lack of emotion or invitation to continue the conversation, felt like a door closing firmly in my face. I couldn't help myself. "I miss talking to you. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime." This time the response took even longer. "I don't think that would be a good idea right now, Ronnie. I've moved on and I think it's best if we both continue on our separate paths." Each word felt like a tiny knife. He'd moved on. Of course he had. I'd been watching it happen in real time through my phone's screen, torturing myself with evidence of his happiness without me. That night, while devouring a pint of ice cream and 3 glasses of wine, I made the catastrophic decision to text again. "Is it because of her, the blonde in your photos, you moved on pretty quickly?" I regretted it immediately, but it was too late to unsend. His response was uncharacteristically blunt. "This is exactly why coffee isn't a good idea. My personal life isn't your concern anymore, Ronnie. You made that choice." Then, after a moment, "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." The finality of it left me sobbing on my kitchen floor. In the days that followed, I spiraled into a dark place. I called in sick again, ignored texts from the few friends still checking on me, and alternated between sleeping too much and not at all. My apartment became a reflection of my mental state. Dishes piled in the sink, laundry overflowing the hamper, takeout containers creating an archaeological record of my decline. I couldn't even bear to look at social media anymore, each glimpse of Bennett's thriving life a reminder of what I'd thrown away. The wake-up call came from the most unexpected source. My normally supportive mother showed up unannounced at my apartment, took one look at the state of both it and me, and said something she'd never said before. "Ronnie, this has gone far enough. You need to take responsibility for your choices." "But Mom, you were the one who," I began. "Yes, I encouraged you to leave because you convinced me he was making you miserable," she interrupted. "But I'm starting to think you were making yourself miserable, and he was just a convenient target." Her words struck with the particular pain of truth. "You can blame me, you can blame your friends, you can even blame Bennett, but at some point, sweetheart, you have to look in the mirror." She stayed the weekend, helping me clean my apartment and listening as I finally allowed myself to be honest about what had happened. How I'd projected all my insecurities onto Bennett, how I'd misinterpreted his patience as indifference, how I'd created problems where none existed because it was easier than admitting that I was the problem. A week ago, Bennett posted a new photo. Him and the blonde woman on a tropical beach, her wearing a ring that caught the sunlight in a way that left no doubt about its significance. They were on that trip to Bali we'd always talked about taking someday. The caption read simply, "She said yes." The comment section exploded with congratulations, including several from mutual friends who'd once been in my corner, but had gradually drifted toward his orbit after our breakup. "You lost a good one," Lacey finally admitted during our most recent catch-up. "We all thought you were crazy at the time, if I'm being honest, but you seemed so determined." When I reminded her of how she'd encouraged me, she shrugged. "I was just supporting my friend. What was I supposed to say?" So here I am, alone in my overpriced apartment that I can barely afford, scrolling through dating apps half-heartedly, knowing none of these men will measure up to the one I threw away. The bathroom scale mocks me daily, the number climbing despite half-hearted attempts at dieting. My mother calls less frequently now, tired of my refusal to move forward. My friends have mostly moved on to more positive social circles. The hardest truth is that Bennett never stopped loving me because of my weight. I stopped loving myself, and I couldn't believe anyone else could love me either. So I pushed and tested and sabotaged until I created exactly the outcome I feared most. Now I'm left with nothing but regret and the painful knowledge that I did this to myself. The question that haunts me isn't, why didn't he love me enough? It's why couldn't I see what was right in front of me until it was gone forever? I've been seeing a therapist for the past month. Dr. Martinez doesn't sugarcoat things or tell me what I want to hear. She challenges me to examine the narratives I create, to question my assumptions, to recognize when I'm projecting my insecurities onto others. The story you told yourself about Bennett not being attracted to you anymore, she said during our second session, was that based on actual evidence, or was it based on how you felt about yourself? The question hit me like a truck. I'd spent so long convinced that my interpretation was reality that I'd never stopped to examine the evidence. Bennett had never criticized my body. He'd never made comments about my weight gain. He'd continued to tell me he loved me even when I was pulling away. But he stopped initiating intimacy, I argued weakly. Did you ask him why? Dr. Martinez countered. Or did you assume you knew the reason? The truth was, I'd never directly asked. I dropped hints, made passive-aggressive comments, but I'd never actually said, I notice you're not initiating sex anymore. Is it because of my weight gain? I'd been too afraid of the answer, so I'd written my own version that confirmed my worst fears. People often act on what they believe to be true rather than seeking out what is actually true, Dr. Martinez explained. It's easier to protect ourselves from potential rejection by rejecting others first. We talked about my father leaving when I was 12, how that early abandonment had shaped my expectations of relationships. We talked about my ex who had cheated, reinforcing the idea that I wasn't enough. We talked about how my mother's bitterness had influenced my own views of men and relationships. But none of that excuses what I did to Bennett, I said tearfully. No, it doesn't, Dr. Martinez agreed. Understanding the why doesn't erase the what, but understanding can help you avoid repeating the same patterns in the future. On my worst days, I still find myself slipping back into old habits. I'll catch a glimpse of my reflection and feel the self-loathing rise up. I'll draft text to Bennett that I never send. I'll scroll through dating apps measuring each potential match against an impossible standard. I'll order takeout instead of cooking the healthy meal I planned. But there are better days, too. Days when I can look in the mirror and see myself clearly, without the distortion of my insecurities. Days when I can acknowledge that, yes, I made a terrible mistake, but that mistake doesn't define who I am or who I can become. I've started taking small steps toward rebuilding my life. I joined a support group for emotional eating. I reconnected with some old friends who knew me before the breakup, before I became so consumed with validation. I even adopted a cat, something Bennett had been allergic to, a small act of moving forward rather than staying stuck in the past. Last month, I ran into one of Bennett's friends at the grocery store. Mark had always been friendly to me during our relationship, though we were never particularly close. How's Bennett? I asked, trying to sound casual, as if I didn't regularly check his social media for updates. Mark hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He's good, getting married in the spring. I admitted. She seems nice. She is, Mark said, then added after a pause, she's good for him. Different than what you guys had, but good. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to ask more, to know all the details about their relationship, to torture myself with comparisons. But another part, a healthier part that I was trying to nurture, knew that wasn't the right path. Tell him I'm happy for him, I said instead. I mean that. And the surprising thing was, I did mean it. Not completely, not without a twinge of regret and jealousy. But I was beginning to understand that loving someone sometimes means wanting their happiness even when you're not the source of it. Mark seemed relieved. I will. Take care of yourself, Ronnie. As he walked away, I realized it was the first time I'd spoken about Bennett to someone who actually knew him without feeling the need to justify my actions or paint myself as the victim. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. That night, I wrote Bennett a letter I knew I would never send. I apologized for the hurt I'd caused, for the accusations I'd made, for trying to make him the villain in our story. I acknowledged the love he'd shown me and how poorly I'd received it. I wished him happiness in his new relationship and in his life. When I finished, I read it over once, then deleted the file. The letter wasn't for him, it was for me. A way to articulate the regret I felt without burdening him with it. He'd moved on, and trying to insert myself back into his life, even with an apology, would be more about easing my guilt than anything else. The next morning, I woke up and made a decision. I deleted my social media apps. Not permanently, but for now, while I worked on healing. Constantly monitoring Bennett's life wasn't helping me move forward. It was keeping me tethered to a past I couldn't change. I called my mother and had an honest conversation about the way we enable each other's worst tendencies, how we'd both created and maintained a distorted view of my relationship with Bennett. I think I need to take a little space from our talks about my love life, I told her. I love you, but I need to learn to trust my own judgment again. To my surprise, she didn't argue. I think that's wise, sweetheart. I haven't always given you the best advice. I let my own pain color how I see things. I even reached out to Lacey and suggested we meet for coffee. When we did, I was direct in a way I'd never been before. I need friends who will tell me the truth, even when it's not what I want to hear, I told her. Can you be that kind of friend? She looked uncomfortable but nodded. I can try. I didn't realize how much I was just echoing what you wanted to hear until after everything fell apart. That's not real friendship. No, it's not, I agreed. And I wasn't a good friend either, only wanting validation rather than honesty. We're slowly rebuilding our friendship on more authentic terms, though it's not the same as before. Maybe that's for the best. The weight loss has been slower than I'd like, but it's happening. Not because I'm trying to recapture some idealized version of myself that Bennett might have loved, but because I'm learning to care for my body as it is now. I walk in the park 3 mornings a week. I cook most of my meals rather than ordering takeout. I see my therapist regularly. I'd like to say I'm completely healed, that I've forgiven myself for destroying the best relationship of my life, but that wouldn't be true. There are still nights when the regret is so intense it takes my breath away. There are still moments when I catch myself slipping into old, self-destructive thought patterns. But I'm learning to recognize the difference between reality and the stories I tell myself. Learning to value honesty over validation. Learning to love myself enough to believe that someone else could love me too. And maybe someday, I'll find someone who looks at me the way Bennett used to, with that mix of desire and tenderness that made me feel beautiful. But this time I'll be ready to receive that love, to trust it, to believe I deserve it. Because the truth is, Bennett wasn't perfect, but he was perfect for me. And I walked away not because he failed me, but because I failed myself. That's a hard truth to live with, but it's my truth. And facing it is the only way I'll ever have a chance at real happiness. The bathroom scale this morning showed a 5-pound loss. It's not much, but it's progress. Not because the number matters so much, but because it represents me taking care of myself in a way I haven't in a long time. I deleted all the dating apps from my phone yesterday. I'm not ready. Not yet. I need to be whole on my own before I try to be part of someone else's life again. Bennett's wedding invitation arrived in the mail last week. I was surprised he'd send one, given how things ended between us. Perhaps it was a courtesy, or perhaps it was closure, a final acknowledgement of what we had once been to each other. I won't go, of course. That chapter of my life is closed, even if I sometimes wish I could rewrite its ending. But I did send a gift from their registry with a simple note. Wishing you both all the happiness in the world. You deserve it. Ronnie? It's a small gesture, but it feels like the right one. Not a dramatic plea for forgiveness or an attempt to reinsert myself into his life, but a quiet acknowledgement of my genuine wish for his happiness. Dr. Martinez says that's progress. Real growth isn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It's about these small moments of choosing a better path, even when no one is watching. So that's what I'm trying to do now, one day at a time. Choose better, see clearer, love more honestly, starting with myself, because the hardest lesson I've learned is this: no one can love you more than you love yourself. It's not just a cute saying for Instagram posts, it's the truth. Bennett loved me fully, but I couldn't receive that love because I didn't believe I deserved it. I won't make that mistake again. I didn't go to Bennett's wedding, but I saw the photos. They appeared on my feed despite my attempts to distance myself from social media. A mutual friend had tagged Bennett, and just like that, there they were, sun-drenched images of the happy couple on a Balinese beach, surrounded by close friends and family. The bride, Audrey, looked radiant in a simple white dress, her blonde hair adorned with tropical flowers. Bennett looked happier than I'd ever seen him. I'd expected the images to devastate me, to send me spiraling back into the pit of regret and self-loathing I'd been slowly climbing out of. But something unexpected happened instead. As I scrolled through the photos, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't that I didn't feel regret, I still did. But mixed with that regret was something new, a genuine happiness for Bennett. He deserved this joy. He deserved someone who could receive his love without questioning it, who could believe in his sincerity, who didn't create problems where none existed. He deserved Audrey. I closed my laptop and went for a walk. The spring air was crisp, flowers pushing their way through the soil, trees budding with new life. It felt fitting somehow, this season of renewal coinciding with my own tentative steps toward growth. The past year had been the hardest of my life, but also the most transformative. After hitting rock bottom when Bennett got engaged, I'd finally confronted the truth I'd been avoiding. I was the architect of my own unhappiness. With my mother's unexpected but welcome push, I'd started therapy, joined support groups, rebuilt friendships on more honest foundations, and slowly learned to care for myself again. My therapist, Dr. Martinez, had been instrumental in helping me understand the patterns that led to my self-sabotage. We'd unpacked my abandonment issues stemming from my father's departure, the insecurity reinforced by my ex's infidelity, and the ways I'd internalized my mother's distrust of men. Most importantly, she'd helped me see how my inability to love myself had made me unable to believe anyone else could genuinely love me. What would you say to Bennett if you could speak to him now without any expectations? She'd asked during one particularly difficult session. I'd tell him I'm sorry, I'd answered immediately. I'd tell him I didn't understand what was happening at the time, that I was so caught up in my own insecurities that I couldn't see how much he really cared for me. I'd tell him he was right, I was projecting all my fears onto him. And if he were sitting here now, what do you think he would say to you? The question had caught me off guard. I'd spent so long imagining Bennett's anger, his judgment, his contempt, that I'd never considered any other possibility. I think he would say he forgives me, I said slowly, surprising myself with the answer. Not because what I did wasn't hurtful, but because that's who he is. He want me to forgive myself too. Dr. Martinez had nodded. So maybe the forgiveness you're really seeking isn't from Bennett at all. That realization had been a turning point for me. I'd been carrying the weight of what I'd done, using it as further evidence of my unworthiness, rather than as a painful but valuable lesson. The truth was, I could never undo the hurt I'd caused Bennett, but I could stop hurting myself as punishment. I deleted my social media accounts for 6 months after that, part of what Dr. Martinez called a digital detox. Without the constant temptation to check on Bennett's life or compare myself to others, I'd found more mental space for real healing. I'd reconnected with old hobbies, painting, which I'd loved in college but abandoned as impractical, hiking, which Bennett had enjoyed but I'd always made excuses to avoid, cooking, which had become a form of self-care rather than a chore. The weight I'd gained began to come off, not because I was punishing my body with restrictive diets, but because I was nourishing it properly and moving it regularly. My clothes started to fit better, but more importantly, I started to feel more comfortable in my own skin, regardless of its size. I'd reconnected with friends I'd pushed away during my relationship with Bennett, not the echo chamber friends like Lacey who only told me what I wanted to hear, but friends who had always been honest with me, even when I hadn't wanted to listen. Friends like Tara, who had gently tried to suggest that my insecurities were clouding my judgment, and whom I'd subsequently frozen out for her disloyalty. I should have tried harder to get through to you, Tara said when we finally met for coffee after nearly a year of silence. No, I replied, I wouldn't have heard you. I was only listening to people who validated what I already believed. My relationship with my mother had undergone its own transformation. After her unexpected intervention, we'd had several difficult but necessary conversations about how her own experiences had shaped her advice to me, and by extension, my choices. I think I wanted you to leave Bennett because it confirmed what I already believed about men, she admitted during one particularly honest phone call. That they'll always hurt you eventually, so it's better to leave first. But that's not always true, is it? I asked. There was a long pause before she answered. No, it's not. Your father hurt me deeply, and I never really recovered from that. I didn't want you to experience the same pain, but in trying to protect you, I might have encouraged you toward exactly what I was afraid of. That conversation had led to my mother starting her own therapy journey, examining the beliefs and behaviors she'd carried for decades. Our relationship was now based on mutual respect for each other's growth rather than codependent validation. Work had become another arena for positive change. After the initial awkwardness with Derek had faded, I'd refocused on my career, earning another promotion and building a reputation as a fair but effective manager. The validation I'd once sought from male attention, I now found in my professional accomplishments. Dating remained complicated. I'd had a few short-lived connections, none of which developed into anything serious. Part of me was still healing, still learning to trust my own judgment again. But I was no longer afraid of being alone. I'd built a life that felt meaningful and fulfilling, with or without a romantic partner. When Bennett's wedding invitation had arrived, I'd been genuinely surprised. We hadn't spoken in over a year, our only connection being the occasional update from mutual friends. The envelope sat unopened on my counter for 3 days before I finally worked up the courage to read it. Inside was a traditional invitation, along with a handwritten note. Ronnie, I know this might seem strange, but it felt wrong not to include you. What we had was real and important to me, even if it ended painfully. There are no hard feelings on my end, only gratitude for the time we shared and the lessons we both learned. You're welcome to come, but I'll understand completely if you don't. Either way, I wish you all the best. Bennett. I'd cried for an hour after reading it, not from jealousy or regret, but from relief. The Bennett I'd known and loved, kind, thoughtful, generous of spirit, was still there. He had moved on, found happiness with someone else, but he hadn't become bitter or resentful. He'd grown just as I was trying to do. I didn't attend the wedding, of course. That would have been inappropriate, a misplacement of myself in a narrative that was no longer mine. But I did send a gift from their registry, a high-quality camera similar to one Bennett had once mentioned wanting, along with a note wishing them happiness. It was a small gesture of goodwill, of letting go, of moving forward. So here I was, a year and a half after our breakup, walking through a park in spring, feeling something close to peace for the first time in a very long time. The woman I'd been when I left Bennett, insecure, projecting, seeking external validation, felt almost like a stranger now. Not completely gone, her voice still whispered in my ear sometimes, but no longer the dominant force guiding my actions. As I rounded a bend in the path, I spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench ahead, reading a book. Mark, Bennett's friend who I'd run into at the grocery store several months ago. For a moment, I considered turning around, avoiding the potentially awkward interaction. But that would have been the old Ronnie running from discomfort. Instead, I continued forward. "Hi, Mark," I said as I approached. He looked up, surprise evident on his face. "Ronnie, hey, good to see you." "You too, mind if I sit for a minute?" He shifted to make room on the bench. "Not at all." An awkward silence hung between us briefly before we both spoke at once. "I saw the wedding photos," I mentioned to Bennett. We both laughed, the tension breaking slightly. "You first," Mark offered. "I just wanted to say that the wedding looked beautiful. They look happy together." Mark nodded, watching me carefully as if assessing my sincerity. They're good for each other." Another pause, less awkward this time. "I told Bennett I ran into you," Mark continued. "He asked about you, how you seemed. I hope you don't mind that I said you looked well." "I don't mind," I replied, touched that Bennett had asked about me. "Did you get married in Bali? The photos were gorgeous." "Yeah, it was incredible. Small ceremony, just close friends and family. Bennett's parents rented this amazing villa right on the beach." As Mark shared details about the wedding, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was still regret, of course, a whisper of what could have been, but it wasn't overwhelming. I could hear about Bennett's happiness without it destroying me, could imagine him starting this new chapter without feeling like my own story had ended. "They asked about the camera, by the way," Mark said, shifting topics. "The one you sent as a wedding gift. Bennett recognized your handwriting on the card. He was really touched." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak for a moment. "It was the one he always talked about wanting." He remembered. "He uses it all the time now." Actually, most of those wedding photos you saw were taken with it. There was something poetic about that, about Bennett capturing the happiest day of his new life with a gift from his past. Not everything had to be erased or forgot. Some things could be repurposed, transformed into something new. We chatted for a few more minutes about neutral topics: work, the unseasonably warm weather, a new coffee shop that had opened nearby. As I stood to leave, Mark seemed to hesitate. "They're having a housewarming next month," he said finally. "Bennett and Audrey bought a place just outside the city. Nothing fancy, just a few friends getting together. I know Bennett would be glad to see you if you wanted to come, just as friends, of course." The invitation caught me off guard. My first instinct was to politely decline, to protect myself from what would undoubtedly be a difficult situation. But I was trying to make different choices now, to face things directly rather than avoiding them. "I'll think about it," I said honestly. "Thank you for telling me." As I walked away, I realized I actually meant it. I would think about it, consider whether I was ready for that kind of closure, that kind of new beginning. A year ago, even 6 months ago, the answer would have been an automatic no. But now I wasn't so sure. That evening, I called Dr. Martinez and scheduled an extra session to discuss the invitation. We talked through my mixed feelings, the potential benefits and risks of attending. "There's no right or wrong answer here, Ronnie," she said. "The question is whether seeing Bennett and Audrey together in their new home would be healing for you or harmful." "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Part of me wants to see him, to show him that I'm okay, that I've grown. But part of me is afraid it will undo all the progress I've made." "Those are valid concerns. What would it mean to you to attend this gathering?" I thought carefully before answering. "I think it would mean that I've truly accepted what happened, that I can face Bennett without shame or expectation, that I can be happy for him without it diminishing me." "And are you there yet?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think I might be closer than I realized." In the end, I decided to go. Not immediately, not without preparation, but with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. Dr. Martinez helped me develop a plan. I would bring a friend as support, set a time limit for how long I would stay, and have an exit strategy if things became too difficult. Most importantly, I would go with the intention of showing genuine goodwill, not with hidden hopes of reconnection or dramatic closure. The day of the housewarming arrived with unexpected calmness. I wore a simple outfit that made me feel confident, but not like I was trying too hard. Tara agreed to come with me, understanding the complexity of the situation and offering quiet support. When Bennett opened the door, his surprise was evident despite Mark's warning that I might attend. For a brief moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of our shared history palpable between us. Ronnie, he said finally, a small smile forming. I'm really glad you came. Thanks for having me, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. This is my friend Tara. Bennett welcomed us both warmly, introducing us to a few people gathered in the living room before excusing himself to check on something in the kitchen. Tara squeezed my hand reassuringly before moving toward the drink table, giving me a moment alone. The house was lovely, a charming older home with character and warmth. Photos lined the mantel, most of them from the wedding or their honeymoon, Bennett and Audrey looking sun-kissed and happy. I allowed myself to really look at them, to acknowledge the life Bennett had built after me. It hurt, but not in the devastating way I had feared, more like the ache of an old injury that had mostly healed. You must be Ronnie, came a voice from behind me. I turned to find Audrey, Bennett's wife, standing there with 2 glasses of wine. She offered one to me. Bennett mentioned you might be coming. I'm Audrey. I accepted the glass, trying to hide my surprise at her friendly approach. It's nice to meet you. Your home is beautiful. Thank you, we're still settling in, but it already feels like home. She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. I hope it's not strange that I wanted to meet you. Bennett speaks very highly of you. The generosity of this statement from the woman who had every right to view me as the ex who had hurt her husband was overwhelming. I took a sip of wine to compose myself. That's kind of him, and kind of you to say. I managed a genuine smile. You two look very happy together. We are, she confirmed without a hint of smugness or territorial marking. I'm lucky to have found him. No, I said, the truth of it settling over me like a warm blanket. He's the lucky one. Audrey's smile widened, and in that moment a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying lifted from my shoulders. This woman wasn't my replacement or my superior. She was simply the right person for Bennett in a way that, ultimately, I hadn't been. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and cautious reconnection. Bennett and I spoke briefly a few times, never alone, never about anything deeper than surface pleasantries. But there was an understanding in his eyes when he looked at me, a recognition of the growth we'd both experienced. As Tara and I prepared to leave, Bennett walked us to the door. Thank you for coming, he said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. It meant a lot. Thank you for inviting me. I hesitated, then added, You have a beautiful life, Bennett. I'm really happy for you. He nodded, understanding the layers beneath my simple statement. I hope you're finding your way toward that too, Ronnie. You deserve it. As Tara and I walked to the car, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd received dramatic forgiveness or closure, but because I'd faced one of my greatest fears, seeing Bennett happy with someone else, and survived it. More than survived it, I'd found a kind of peace with it. I felt something shift inside me that night. I told Dr. Martinez during our next session, trying to articulate the strange sense of peace I'd found at Bennett's housewarming. Like I finally accepted that he's part of my past, not my future. That's significant progress, she agreed. How did you feel about meeting Audrey? Surprisingly okay. She was kind, genuine. I can see why he loves her. She's nothing like me. Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow. Is that important to you? That she's different, I considered the question carefully. I think it makes it easier somehow. If she were similar to me, I might wonder if he was trying to replace me with a better version. But she's her own person entirely. Their relationship isn't a reflection on what we had or didn't have. That's a mature perspective, Dr. Martinez noted. You're seeing their relationship for what it is, not as a commentary on your worth. 2 years after leaving Bennett, my life had found a new rhythm. I'd been promoted again at work, now heading the entire digital marketing department. The responsibility was challenging but fulfilling, a healthy outlet for my creative energy and analytical skills. I'd maintain my healthier habits, regular exercise, cooking nutritious meals, limiting alcohol, not with the punishing intensity of someone trying to atone for past mistakes, but with the consistent care of someone who had learned to value herself. My apartment, once a sad reminder of what I'd lost, had become a sanctuary. I'd repainted, rearranged furniture, filled it with plants and art that brought me joy. My cat Milo had grown from a skittish rescue kitten into a confident, affectionate companion who greeted me at the door each evening and curled up beside me while I read or watched TV. Dating remained complicated. I'd had one relationship that lasted almost 6 months with a kind, patient man named Julian who worked in environmental law. We connected intellectually and enjoyed each other's company, but the spark never quite ignited. When he was offered a job in Seattle, we parted amicably, both acknowledging that what we had wasn't worth trying to maintain long distance. There had been other dates, some promising, others disastrous, but I approached each with a new mindfulness. I was no longer looking for someone to validate me or fill a void. I was looking for a genuine connection with a person who complemented the life I'd built for myself. And if that person never appeared, I was increasingly comfortable with the idea that my life could still be rich and meaningful on its own terms. My friendship with Lacey had evolved into something more honest, though less intense than before. We no longer served as each other's echo chambers, reinforcing destructive patterns with blind support. Instead, we'd learned to challenge each other gently, to offer perspectives that might not be what the other wanted to hear but needed to consider. "Remember when I used to tell you that you deserved someone who worshipped the ground you walked on?" she asked during one of our monthly dinners. How could I forget? It was my favorite form of validation. I laughed, only half joking. "God, that was toxic," she sighed. "I realize now I was saying what I thought a supportive friend should say, not what would actually help you." "We both needed to grow up," I acknowledged. "I wanted someone to tell me I was right, not someone to help me see things clearly." My relationship with my mother had undergone perhaps the most profound transformation. After her unexpected moment of tough love when I hit rock bottom, she'd started her own therapy journey, examining how her experiences had shaped her worldview and by extension her parenting. "I think I wanted you to leave Bennett because it confirmed what I already believed about men," she admitted during one particularly honest conversation. "That they'll always hurt you eventually, so it's better to leave first." "But that's not always true, is it?" I asked. She sighed deeply. "No, it's not. Your father hurt me deeply, and I never really recovered from that. I didn't want you to experience the same pain, but in trying to protect you, I might have encouraged you toward exactly what I was afraid of." This new honesty between us had allowed a more authentic relationship to develop, one based on mutual respect rather than codependent patterns. She'd even started dating again after nearly 20 years of self-imposed solitude, tentatively opening herself to the possibility of connection. After the housewarming party, my occasional encounters with Bennett became less fraught, more natural. We weren't friends exactly, but we could exist in the same social spaces without tension. I'd see him at group gatherings organized by mutual friends, exchange pleasant small talk, and leave without feeling like I'd been emotionally gutted. It was at one such gathering, a summer barbecue hosted by Mark and his girlfriend, that I overheard news that sent an unexpected jolt through me. Bennett and Audrey were expecting their first child. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally. I was refilling my water glass in the kitchen when Audrey's sister entered, talking excitedly on her phone about nursery colors and baby showers. She noticed me and quickly ended her call looking embarrassed. "Sorry about that," she said. "I'm just excited about becoming an aunt. They're planning to announce it today, so I probably shouldn't be blabbing." "No worries," I assured her, keeping my voice steady despite the sudden tightness in my chest. "That's wonderful news." I excused myself and stepped outside, needing a moment to process this unexpected information. The backyard was quieter, just a few people scattered around, none paying attention to me as I found a secluded spot under a tree. The news shouldn't have affected me. Bennett and I had been over for more than 2 years. He was married to someone else, building a life I had no part in. Of course they would have children. It was the natural progression of things, yet I found myself fighting tears, not from jealousy or resentment, but from a strange, bittersweet mixture of emotions I couldn't immediately identify. Was it grief for the future I'd once imagined for us? Regret for the choices that had led us here? Or something else entirely? "You okay?" came a voice startling me from my thoughts. Tara, who had become my closest friend over the past year, stood nearby with concern in her eyes. I just heard Bennett and Audrey are having a baby, I said quietly. Tara sat beside me, not offering immediate platitudes or asking how I felt, just providing silent companionship while I sorted through my emotions. I'm happy for them, I said finally, surprised to find I meant it. Really, I am. Bennett will be an amazing father. Tara prompted gently. But it makes it so final, you know. Not that I harbored any delusions we'd get back together. I know that ship sailed long ago. It's just a baby is so permanent, such a clear marker of moving forward. And you're worried you haven't moved forward enough. I considered this. Maybe I'm just confronting the reality of what I threw away. Not just Bennett, but the possibility of that life, those children. Tara nodded thoughtfully. Those are valid feelings. But Ronnie, you know better than anyone that what you had with Bennett wasn't working, not because he wasn't right, but because you weren't ready. You weren't in a place to receive love or build a healthy family. I know, I agreed. And logically, I understand that dwelling on what might have been is pointless. I made my choices, he made his. We're both where we're supposed to be. Logic doesn't always dictate our emotions, Tara reminded me. It's okay to feel complicated things about this news. It doesn't mean you want him back or that you begrudge them their happiness. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes before rejoining the party. When Bennett and Audrey made their announcement, I managed a genuine smile and offered sincere congratulations along with everyone else. If Bennett was surprised by my composure, he didn't show it, thanking me with the same warmth he showed to all their well-wishers. Later, as I prepared to leave, Audrey approached me alone. "Ronnie, can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked. We stepped onto the front porch, away from the noise of the party. I braced myself, unsure what to expect. "I wanted to thank you," she said, surprising me. "Thank me for what?" "For being gracious about our news today. I know it might not be easy to hear." I was touched by her consideration, but also slightly embarrassed that she thought I needed special handling. "Audrey, you don't need to worry about me. I'm genuinely happy for you both." She smiled, placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "I believe you are, but I also know that loving someone doesn't just stop because a relationship ends. Bennett speaks of you with such respect. I know you were important to each other." Her perception and kindness disarmed me completely. "He's a good man," I said simply. "Your child is lucky to have him as a father." "I think so too," she agreed, then hesitated before adding, "I hope this doesn't sound strange, but I think you played a part in making him the man he is today. Our experiences shape us, right? So in some small way, you're part of our story too." The generosity of this perspective, seeing me not as the villain in their love story, but as a meaningful chapter in Bennett's life, moved me deeply. That's a beautiful way to look at it. Thank you. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on Audrey's words. The idea that my relationship with Bennett, despite its painful ending, had contributed something positive to his growth was comforting. Perhaps we don't have to erase our past mistakes to move forward. Maybe they become integrated into who we're becoming, lessons rather than just regrets. I called Dr. Martinez the next day and scheduled an extra session to process my feelings about Bennett's news. We talked through the complex emotions it had stirred up, the mix of genuine happiness for him alongside the renewed awareness of what I'd lost through my own actions. "I think what I'm feeling isn't exactly regret anymore," I explained, struggling to find the right words. "It's more like acknowledging that there's a version of my life that could have included Bennett and children and that traditional happiness, but accepting that's not the path I'm on." "That sounds like grief," Dr. Martinez suggested. "Not for Bennett specifically, but for the future you once imagined." "Yes, that's it exactly," I agreed, feeling the rightness of her words. "And I think it's healthy grief, not the kind that keeps you stuck, but the kind that helps you let go. Grief is how we honor what mattered to us," she nodded. "It's part of how we integrate our experiences and move forward." Over the next few months, I continued building my own life while occasionally hearing updates about Bennett and Audrey's pregnancy through mutual friends. They were having a boy. They had painted the nursery blue and yellow. Bennett was reading parenting books and attending birthing classes with characteristic thoroughness. Each piece of news affected me less, becoming simply information about people I knew rather than emotional triggers about my past mistakes. I was healing, truly healing, in a way I hadn't thought possible when I'd first realized the magnitude of what I'd thrown away. 6 months after the barbecue, I received a text from Bennett. William James Harris arrived last night. 7 pounds 8 Oz. Everyone healthy and happy. Attached was a photo of a tiny newborn with Bennett's chin and Audrey's nose, wrapped in a hospital blanket. I stared at the image for a long time, waiting for the pain to hit, the jealousy, the regret. Instead, I felt a surprising sense of peace, even joy. This child represented new beginnings, not just for Bennett and Audrey, but in a strange way for me too. His arrival marked the final chapter in my old story, allowing me to fully embrace whatever came next. "Congratulations," I texted back. "He's beautiful. You're going to be an amazing dad." Bennett's response came quickly. "Thank you, Ronnie. That means a lot." 4 simple words, yet they carried the weight of our shared history and mutual forgiveness. We had both moved on, found our separate paths, and could now wish each other well without the burden of what might have been. That night, I added a new entry to the journal Dr. Martinez had encouraged me to keep, a record of my journey towards self-acceptance and growth. Today, Bennett's son was born. I thought I would feel renewed regret for what I lost, but instead I feel a strange sense of completion. The circle has closed. Whatever bond Bennett and I once shared has transformed into something different, not friendship exactly, but mutual goodwill. I no longer look at my past with him as a failure or a mistake, but as a necessary chapter in my story, a painful but valuable lesson in how insecurity can poison love if we let it. I don't know what my future holds. I'm dadding again cautiously, with clearer eyes and a healthier heart. I've rebuilt relationships with friends and family on more honest foundations. I've created a life that fulfills me, whether or not it ever includes the traditional markers of success I once thought essential. Most importantly, I've learned to believe that I am worthy of love, not despite my flaws and struggles, but including them. I've learned that real love doesn't require perfection or performance, just authenticity and courage. I've learned that the greatest obstacle to receiving love isn't other people's judgment, but our own inability to believe we deserve it. Bennett never stopped loving me because of my weight. I stopped loving myself, and I couldn't believe anyone else could love me either. So I pushed and tested and sabotaged until I created exactly the outcome I feared most. But that's not the end of my story. It's just the end of a chapter, and I'm finally ready to turn the page. 3 years to the day after I walked away from Bennett, I found myself sitting in a sunlit cafe, waiting for a blind date arranged by Tara. I wasn't nervous exactly, but present, aware of the moment, and open to possibilities without expectations. When Jason walked in, there was no dramatic movie moment, no instant recognition of a soulmate. Just a kind smile, a firm handshake, an easy conversation that stretched from 1 cup of coffee to 2, then lunch, then a walk in the nearby park as neither of us wanted the day to end. He was different from Bennett in almost every way, boisterous where Bennett was thoughtful, spontaneous where Bennett was deliberate, a musician where Bennett was analytical. But the fundamental things, kindness, integrity, emotional intelligence, those were there in abundance. On our 3rd date, as we sheltered from a sudden rainstorm under the awning of a bookstore, he kissed me. There were no butterflies or fireworks, just a quiet certainty, a feeling of rightness that didn't need dramatic confirmation. "I should tell you something," I said when we drew apart. "I was in a serious relationship that ended badly because of my insecurities. I've done a lot of work on myself since then, but I think you should know that I'm still learning how to be a good partner." Jason nodded, taking my hand. "Thank you for telling me. I appreciate your honesty. We're all works in progress, Ronnie. The important thing is that we're progressing, not perfect." 6 months later, when I ran into Bennett at the grocery store, his son sleeping peacefully in a carrier on his chest, I was able to chat easily, sharing news of my life, including mention of Jason, without discomfort or hidden agenda. Bennett seemed genuinely pleased for me, just as I was for him. As we parted ways, he said something that stayed with me. "I'm glad we both found our way, Ronnie, even if it wasn't the path we originally thought we'd take." Walking to my car, I reflected on how far I'd come from the woman who had walked away from the best relationship of her life because she couldn't believe she deserved to be loved. That woman felt like a distant relative now, someone I understood and had compassion for, but was no longer bound to emulate. The question that used to haunt me, why couldn't I see what was right in front of me until it was gone forever, no longer carried the same sting. I had learned its answer, because I wasn't ready to see it, because I needed to learn to see myself clearly first. Some lessons can only be learned through loss. Some growth can only happen through pain. My journey hadn't been easy or straightforward, but it had led me here, to a place of self-acceptance, of open-hearted possibility, of genuine peace with my past and hope for my future. I wasn't the same person who had met Bennett at that backyard barbecue all those years ago. I wasn't even the same person who had left him, convinced he couldn't possibly love my changing body. I was someone new, forged in the fire of regret and remorse, tempered by therapy and self-reflection, strengthened by the painful awareness of my own capacity for self-sabotage. I was someone who could now recognize love when it was offered, who could believe in its sincerity without needing constant reassurance, who understood that true intimacy requires vulnerability rather than performance. I was someone who had learned, through the hardest possible lesson, that the most important relationship I would ever have was with myself. And for the first time in my adult life, that relationship was built on a foundation of truth, acceptance, and genuine care rather than criticism, doubt, and punishment. I had finally learned to be faithful to myself, to trust my own worth, to believe that I deserved love not because I was perfect, but because I was authentically, imperfectly human. That night, as Jason and I cooked dinner together in my apartment, Milo weaving between our legs, hopping for dropped ingredients, I felt a sense of contentment that had nothing to do with achieving some idealized version of happiness and everything to do with being present in this simple, ordinary moment. "What are you smiling about?" Jason asked, catching my expression as he chopped vegetables. "Just thinking about how life takes you places you never expected," I replied. "Sometimes the long way around is the only way to get where you need to be," he nodded, understanding without needing the full context. "I'm glad your path led you here." "Me too," I said, and meant it completely.